Well, good evening. I know you all having a good time, and it's wonderful to see you all here, and we're really looking forward to our speaker this evening. But I want to take a little bit of time, as we always do at this annual event, to talk about the Friends of the Libraries and all the wonderful work you do, and then a little bit about the libraries. And I promise you I won't take too long, but I want to celebrate the great things that both those organizations do. And my second slide here, actually I put up earlier because so many people were coming up to me and saying, I want to know the menu and where I can find it in the cookbooks. So here you have it, and there's also a copy at the table with the cookbooks, and if you want to purchase cookbooks later and get them signed, you too can recreate this menu tonight, or another night rather, so for your enjoyment. So this is a chance to look back on the year and tell you a little bit about both the Friends and the libraries. And I'm always amazed at the events that our great Friends of the Library boards put together. And this year was no exception. We started in fall with Isabel Wilkerson, wonderful Pulitzer Prize winning author. Her books have been bestsellers on the top 10 list of every newspaper you can imagine. Her book, The Warmth of Other Suns, about the migration from the South. Fabulous event, fully packed, engaged audience. We moved on in November to an event honoring one of our former presidents of the Friends of the Library Board, Paul Nagel, and an event celebrating really public historians. And Richard Bowe entertained us and engaged us really in talking about his new book about Franklin Roosevelt. Following the PBS series, The Roosevelts, a very engaging evening, and it was really special that Fritz Mondale could introduce him as his former boss. A wonderful event. Many among you are mystery writers, or maybe writers, but mystery readers as well. And Mary Logie was interviewed and a great conversation with board member Maria Jetty. And then in January, we had our annual Feast of Words, where we celebrate a faculty member from the university, and in this case, we had Brenda Child from the American Studies Department talk about Ojibwe language, and also in a way to celebrate the work that the libraries have done to create the Ojibwe People's Dictionary, a marvelous multimedia resource celebrating that language. And just last month, Poetry Month in April, we had Michael Dennis Brown, the librettist and poet. But this was a special event. It was not just celebrating poetry, but we also had the university singers and composers in the audience, and his words were put to music. And I'm going to just treat you to a few seconds of that song, or of one of the songs. But I will tell you that all of it is online if you want to enjoy it again or for the first time. So here we go. You saw a very brief snippet, but it was extraordinarily moving performance, and his poetry, the new volume that he just released entitled Voices, I really recommend to you. And then so many exhibits during the year, often accompanied with a program. We celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Social Welfare Archives with Clark Chambers, whom I'm sure many of you know. Ralph Rapson, the architect who designed the first Guthrie and so many other celebrated buildings. We had a wonderful event with his family as well, including one of his sons was supposed to be at the White House that night, and he chose coming to see us instead. It was a great event. And then, as you also heard earlier, we celebrate our staff and our students, and the photo contest is something that not only helps students express themselves and say something about their perspective on the library, but it's also free photography that we can use for the year. So I'm sure we will be using these in many, many communications pieces. So that's a little snippet of what the Friends do, but let me share somewhat of what the libraries have done in the last year. So many of you, I'm sure, remember the library as place. And Wilson Library on the West Bank, 1960s building. It was the first building on campus with air conditioning, so that kind of dates it for you. I would call it a kind of mid-century modern, and over the years, many, many years, probably 50-some years, it became a rabbit warren of divided up spaces. So this year we've begun the first phase of renovation with the first floor, much more contemporary, and the students love it. A lot of spaces for students to collaborate, which is something that probably most of us didn't do when we were in college, but they certainly do now. And our hope is in the rest of the decade we can phase by phase renovate the rest of the building. Now, students enjoy spaces, but if you read the papers, you know that one of the main concerns about higher education is student affordability and access to higher education. So we've taken that to heart, and one of our initiatives this year is to deal with student costs for course materials, textbooks. So you see some data up here. I'll highlight the one that's $1,200 a year for student textbooks. That's the average. But what really scares me is to see the 65% of students who say they don't buy a textbook because they can't afford it. And also, perhaps there are publishers in the room, but the marketplace gets quite a benefit from the student population. So this year we undertook something called the Partnership for Affordable Content. 3 main goals. One was to create a library, if you will, of open textbooks. These are freely available, and we've worked with universities around the country to not only get them to adopt the textbooks, but to get faculty to review them so that the peer review engenders greater adoption. We've worked on digital course packs to take all the course materials that a faculty member might assign, make them digital, deal with the royalty permissions where necessary, and deliver them so that 7x24 a student can get them. And then lastly, working with faculty with some small incentive grants to get them to work with us to reduce the costs of the materials they assign to students. And I can tell you that in the digital course pack project alone, we reached in a pilot phase about 10,000 students, 400 courses, and we saved the students $400,000. So we felt pretty good about that. Yeah. As a parent of a student, I can tell you this is important. So on the research side, the university is really engaged now in thinking about, and its new strategic plan is all about grand challenges. How do we look at the big problems facing society? And a lot of that deals with how to integrate data and information from multiple disciplines. How do we look at epidemiology and demographic information to see the spread of disease? How do we look at weather data and also crop data to see how climate change is happening? That all happens because we can bring data together from different disciplines. The federal government has seized upon this and required of many of their grantees in the federal agencies, required that the principal investigators have data management plans, and also often that they make the data publicly available and well managed. So we launched something called the Data Repository for the University of Minnesota, otherwise known as DRUM. And faculty can then deposit their data, we'll manage it, and we'll keep it around for the long term. So the example you see up here, which I think deals with climate change and weather, I'm not sure I can read it, but I looked at it earlier. That was launched in November. That faculty member deposited those data, and it's been downloaded 500 times from around the world. That tells you something about the impact that we can have if we can share data. A couple of other things that are on the horizon. We know that we need to make the research of the university more available around the world, and we also know that sometimes we need to work with publishers to make their content available. So we will be launching a copyright permission service, but also a publishing service so that departments and units of the university can make things available. Now, if I were to make a poll around the room and I asked you what you think of when you think of libraries, you would probably say books, right? You don't think of that? Collections. So all of these things are separate and apart from the collections that we build, 8.2 million volumes strong at the moment. And those collections are certainly important, but what's incredibly important is the things that we have that are unique. And just a quick list of some of the distinctive collections that were added this year: the Children's Theater Collection Archive, Lance Brockman's collection dealing with screen and set design, the Whittington Press, which is a UK fine printing press publications, and the Carlson Corporation archives, everything that has happened out in Carlson world. Real diverse set of types of resources, and you can see some of the other selected collections there. And that's what we're about, preserving the distinctive also for the future. But it's not enough just to collect these things. How do we share them? So one of the other things we did this year was to join a growing national enterprise called the Digital Public Library of America. This is a largely foundation-funded enterprise that pulls together digital content from organizations around the U.S., largely, as I say, foundation-funded, but within the state, we have supported something called the Minnesota Digital Library, where we have 160 museums and libraries and archives, historical societies that have contributed content to this digital archive. And we've then shared that within this national DPLA, as it's called, enterprise. Just in the 2 years that we've been part of this, we've increased our content by 1,000%. We're up to 500,000 items that we've shared, everything from the Historical Society to very small historical organizations within the state. And what's interesting is that it's not just being able to view the images or read the manuscripts, but people are developing all sorts of applications, whether it's K through 12 educational materials or exhibits about the Native Americans in Minnesota. Wonderful resources available to everyone in the globe freely. Along those lines, we've also worked with Penumbra Theater locally to develop something called Umbra. Now, those of you who know that word, it's the dark side of the moon. And Umbra really is meant to reflect the fact that the cultural heritage of African Americans is poorly represented. So our goal with Umbra is similar to DPLA, the Digital Public Library of America, to pull together from over 500 institutions so far around the United States all of the content dealing with African American culture and history. We're really excited about this. We've had 2 federal grants and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, a most recent grant. And last but not least, to think about the ways in which libraries collect other kinds of media. So the kinds of history that I've shared thus far are largely print. They're largely photographs, books, the kinds of things in analog, if you will. Moving to digital. But now we have an opportunity to capture history in other ways. So we've been working with the Immigration History Research Center to capture immigrant stories from the region. You probably saw in the Star Tribune last week the story about the fall of Saigon, the 40th anniversary, and the stories that are being collected. That's all the work that we've been doing with the Immigration History Research Center and also Concordia College's Center for Hmong Studies. I have one more little snippet of a video. We'll see if it works, just to give you a sense of these powerful stories.
We live in Phnom Penh, and the communists evacuated us from the city to the jungle. My father was a chemist, working as a chemist. My mom also university graduate before the country collapsed. So when they evacuated my family and many other Cambodian to the jungles, on the way a lot of people killed, died, starvation.
That doesn't do it justice, but there are powerful stories about in Vietnam, in Cambodia, Hmong, Somali. We have many, many different nationalities that were collecting those very personal stories about history. So I'm going to close here with a quote from the president of the university in his State of the University address last month. You know, and he mentioned some things, and I've quoted him here, that I think he certainly was expressing on behalf of the university, but I think we could substitute the word library in any place where he thinks of university. Obviously, he says what we do every day truly matters. I think the libraries feel that. And he goes on to talk about providing an opportunity for discovery, serving as a cradle of culture, and as the keeper of civilization, and working with partners throughout the state. And all of those things, I think, are represented in what the libraries have done this year. So hats off to President Kaler for knowing so well what libraries do. It was great. And also, hats off to all of you, because we couldn't have done it without the Friends of the Library support and all of you who are users. And our libraries are open to everyone, and I'm sure many of you are users. So we truly appreciate your support. Now, on to the main course, as it will. So before we get to our speaker, I want to introduce Megan Coker. She is the curator of the Kirshner Collection of cookbooks. You saw some of those things in the room where we had the reception. And we're really pleased that the Kirshner family was able to join us this evening. Do you want to stand up so we can acknowledge you? This lecture is part of the Kirshner lecture series in honor of Doris Kirshner, who collected this marvelous assemblage of cookbooks, but also kept a record of everything she cooked, every recipe, every menu for the day. Truly extraordinary. So Megan, will you join us and tell us a little about the Kirshner Collection?
Hi, thank you. So I want to give you just a brief introduction, very brief, to this collection. This cookbook collection was first donated to the university in 1985 by Doris Kirshner, and it lived for many years in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition, and then in 2004, it moved over to the libraries, and it currently lives in McGraw Library, which is over on the St. Paul campus. And anyone can come and use this collection. It's right on the main floor, and it's really easy to get to and use, and it's full of great fun things. You saw some of it back there. My favorite things are, there are all these little envelopes, and you open them up and find pamphlets, and you're not sure what you will find, and it's just full of treasures. The items in the collection, we have it started with about 1,500 cookbooks in the original donation, and we're close to 3,000 or so now. Maybe around 3,500. So it's continually growing. Items in the collection range from about 1890 to things we just added last week. So it's a growing collection. It can be used for research on a variety of topics. And it gets used both, practically and for research purposes. Recently, I conducted a survey and asked people, how do you use this collection? And I want to just share a few of the responses I got so you get some idea of the things you can do with a cookbook collection like this. So one person wrote, I discovered the cookbook collection in 2009 just by chance when I was picking up an ILL item. This was shortly after my mother passed away. She loved to cook and loved cookbooks. It's a place I can go and feel a connection with her. Another person wrote, I use this cookbook collection to find new recipes and cooking techniques as my home cookbook collection is limited. So very practical. And then I had somebody write, I do research on how cookbooks present gender roles and on product placement in cookbooks. So that sort of encompasses some of the range of what you can do. I also heard from food bloggers, historians, and people who just like to relax and look at the recipes there. And there are millions of projects and things you can do with this type of collection. Cookbook collections are such a valuable resource for so many reasons, and I'm so pleased to get to work with this collection, and that the Kirshners support outreach and programming through this collection as well, such as tonight's program. So I hope that you enjoy the program tonight and that you will come visit the collection if you haven't already. Thanks.
So a review in the Washington Post describes Deborah Madison this way. Deborah Madison has done for vegetarian meals what the television show Extreme Makeover has done for the dowdy, transformed them into something sexy and appealing. She's done it with a combination of relaxed charm, a warmingly reassuring writing style, and reliable recipes. And I might add that it has earned her a variety, an entire pantry full of prestigious awards. Several James Beard Awards, a Julia Child Cookbook of the Year prize, among the many other awards and honors. Now, I'm not sure if this was the career path that she was dreaming of as a girl on a dairy farm in upstate New York, or even whether she moved to a walnut grove in California, but both experiences informed her love of cooking and her interest in gardening. As a student of the San Francisco Zen Center for 18 years, she held a number of kitchen positions. But after eating her first meal at Chez Panisse, she immediately went to work there until opening her first restaurant, Green's in San Francisco, one of the first farm-to-table restaurants, and later Cafe Escalera in Santa Fe. Known as a chef, a cooking teacher, and writer, she is also an avid home gardener, and she has written at one point, quote, "Connecting people to the food they eat, its source and its history, has long been my work, and writing is one way to reveal the deeper culture of food." So I'm assuming after tonight's meal, I think all of us believe that, and we're really glad that you absorbed that culture, and we look forward to hearing from you. Please join me in welcoming Deborah Madison. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I love libraries. Oops. I wasn't supposed to do something. Maybe that's still on. I don't know. I do love libraries, and this town and this university has so many, and it's so great to be at a table where librarians and people who love books are being honored. So I thank all of you for including me tonight. It's very inspiring. So a few months ago, I was told about the library of Mrs. Kirshner, and that it was given as a gift to the library. And this caught my attention, not only because of the generosity and the substantial size of the gift, but for other reasons too. One is I realized I have to figure out what I'm going to do with my smaller library of books, but more it caught my attention because last year in Santa Fe, where I live, there was an exhibit at the O'Keeffe Museum of Georgia O'Keeffe's cookbooks. Not all of them, just a little table of them. But I was invited to come view her entire collection later, which I did. And because I was already familiar with O'Keeffe's style of cooking and her tastes around food, I was even more curious about the books that fueled and inspired her cooking and way of eating. So one of the books I saw is a book I owned and had just been given. It's by Samuel Chamberlain, and it was printed in 1952, a book on French regional cooking, which was actually quite unusual for that time. It was given to me because of the gorgeous photographs and the ink drawings in that book. And it was on O'Keeffe's shelf, too. And it's also in the Kirshner Collection. But when I opened O'Keeffe's copy, I found that it had been a gift to her. And that was true of many of the books in her library. So I had to wonder which of the books were really close to the soul of her kitchen. And I believe they were the books that contained scraps of paper, marking recipes, shopping lists, little notes alongside the recipes as to their goodness or not, and that sort of thing. I know, being a writer, that people come to you with their absolutely pristine books and say, I use it all the time. There seems to be a desire to keep books pristine. But personally, I think those books aren't nearly as interesting as the books that have pages that are stuck together with chocolate and notes scribbled in the margins and all that sort of thing. To me, cookbooks are basically very interactive. So, since turning the pages of O'Keeffe's old, well-used books with a card and wearing gloves was tedious work, I decided I would just go to Abe's book and order some of these books for about $1.50, and I could have them at home and read them at my leisure. And I did that, and as I did so, I became acquainted with the books that had influenced the people before my generation of cooks that started in the 70s. And I could certainly be easily tempted to do the same thing with the Kirshner Library because there's so many books from the early half of the last century which have some interesting bearing on today's concerns and tastes around food and diet. I think we tend to think that each generation has invented the world. And we haven't, of course, but we do reshape the stuff of life to make it fit with the times we live in. So, for example, I came across a book called Cook Right and Live Longer that was published in 1966 when I was still in college. But the chapter titles of this book are prescient of some of today's concerns and fixations. For example, what's wrong with civilized cooking? Okay, refined is a dirty word. Well, we have paleo diets, presumably less civilized. Whole Foods sells a whole wheat carrot cake, less refined. Digestible appetizers, raw vegetable salads, smoothies, and vegetable juices. I would never serve those as appetizers, but I did find in the Kirshner Collection a book published in 1962 called Eat Right, the No-Cook Way. We also have the whole raw food fixation, and everyone has their smoothies and their vegetable juices. So again, nothing has really changed that much. Another chapter was entitled Whole Grains for Health. Similarly, in the Kirshner Collection, there's a book called Great Grains, Feed Your Family Right. Both books are concerned with rye and barley and buckwheat, rice bran, gluten flour, lima bean flour, all kinds of things, but not quinoa or teff or amaranth or kamut or spelt or farro or freekeh, because we didn't really know about those grains until fairly recently. Another chapter title was Let's Use More Organ Meats, something that's making a return today with the nose-to-tail cooking. But I also found in Mrs. Kirshner's class notes references to heart and kidney. Again, you know, we're doing this over and over again. And finally, there's a chapter called, close to my heart, whoops, I'm not supposed to do that, Vegetables and How to Cook Them. And we're still trying to figure out vegetables and how to cook them. It's right up my alley. So it's interesting. You know, nothing really changes, it just modifies a little bit. So in viewing the Kirshner Collection, I found it very interesting to come across a book of dinners, quick dinners by Madeleine Kamen called Dinner Against the Clock. Now, I am a huge fan of Madeleine Kamen, and her book, When French Women Cook, really influenced me a lot. I didn't even know about Dinner Against the Clock. It was published in 1973, so I probably wouldn't have known about it, but I suspect it was also a first book for her. There was also a cookbook by Ancel Keys called Eat Well and Stay Well, published in 1959. Now, Ancel Keys, as many of you probably know, was the so-called father of the Mediterranean diet. And I was part of a think tank called Old Ways, and we studied that diet by going around Mediterranean countries for many, many trips. I had no idea he had written a cookbook. You know, we just didn't think of him that way. There's also a wonderful book in that collection that's dedicated to the school lunch, written in 1962. And it's very interesting to go back and see what school lunch was then and what we're struggling with today. What else is there? Fearless Cooking for Men. Well, that was published in 1978, but just last week I got a book in the post called Save the Males, about men cooking. So it's a subject we're still addressing. And then, of course, there's a number of wonderful classical books. This is a very marvelous, eclectic collection that's formed by somebody who really loved cookbooks of all stripes, whether they were pamphlets from a stove company or the marshmallow producer, as you probably saw back there, community books, which are very interesting, or the classic cookbooks. Now, the meaning of this collection for me is that our personal libraries can illuminate and change our lives and those of others. And this is something I want to come back to, but I'm going to digress to my own experience with cookbooks. As Linda said, I did grow up partly on a dairy farm in upstate New York, and then after that in a walnut orchard in California. My father was a botany professor at UC Davis. My mother was an artist. And they were incredibly incompatible when it came to food. My father's taste in food was very Midwestern. He was from Iowa. It was hearty. It was generous. My mother's was frugal beyond belief. They were both born on the same day and went through the Depression fine. So you can't blame it on the Depression. Now, my mother wanted to improve her kids' lives by taking money out of an already meager food budget for music lessons and art lessons. So what happened? I became a chef. My brother became a farmer, and the rest of us go on in that direction. So I'm sorry, Mom. I hope we weren't too much of a disappointment. After college, I went to Japan for a summer, and then I came back to the Bay Area. I really wanted to study Zen Buddhism, and there was this place called the San Francisco Zen Center. We had all bought a big building designed by Julia Morgan that was just absolutely exquisite. And at a house meeting one night, the need for someone to be in charge of the kitchen came up, and my hand shot up. I had absolutely no idea that I was interested. But the kitchen seemed like a good place for me to be. For one, it was around food, and I was a little insecure about food, about not having enough. And the other reason is it just seemed to me that cooking was dynamic and interesting. Now, it didn't bother me that it was vegetarian. I didn't grow up eating a lot of meat. I wasn't a vegetarian, but I just wanted to cook. It just was fine. So the kitchen I inherited from the person before me was a macrobiotic kitchen. He was an incredibly good cook. And macrobiotics didn't really have to be connected to either Zen or to Buddhism. But in those counterculture days, the late 60s and early 70s, it was, for a while at least. When I began cooking, the image of vegetarian food was the dark and dreary one. I think probably some of you know it. Brown foods, heavy foods, strange foods. We had all these boxes and cans of grits and groats in our cupboard, and nobody knew how to use them. Nobody knew how to cook. Why would we? We weren't taught by our mothers. The food was sincere. It was definitely full of fiber and other virtues, but it just wasn't very good. And it wasn't pretty, nor was it recognizable. And also, living in a community where we had a lot of Japanese teachers meant that we ate foods like umeboshi plums, rice bran pickles, tofu, soba, seaweed, and other Japanese foods. Now, if you grew up around the Bay Area, this was not strange. You had eaten in Japanese restaurants. You knew these foods, and quite possibly you loved them. But recently, a few weeks ago, I was having dinner with a man I was ordained with, and he suddenly said with great anger, "I'll never forgive you for serving hijiki and carrots in the third bowl during a sesshin." Hijiki is a kind of seaweed. And I said, "Surely you haven't been thinking about this since 1971. And, but it did make me realize something, and that is if you came to San Francisco from Kansas, or probably from Minneapolis in 1970, you probably had never had hijiki and a lot of other foods, and they would indeed be strange and a little bit upsetting. So one of my first goals was to make food that was familiar. Since we weren't here to be macrobiotic, we were here to study Buddhism. We lived together, and like a family, you want to eat together. So I corrupted what was a rather pure vegan diet, which would probably be enjoyed a lot today. Maybe it is there, I don't know, by introducing eggs, butter, cheese, milk, coffee, sugar, baking powder, olive oil to replace the rancid soy oil, white flour, and other such foods. then that meant we could make pancakes that were light instead of like shoe leather. We could have cheese enchiladas and pizza. We could have cinnamon rolls on Sunday morning with coffee. But really what this meant is that students quit going down to Lum's, the Chinese cafe on the corner, for their all-American breakfast because they could have it here at home, minus the cigarettes and the bacon. So these new foods may not have been the most healthful by today's standards, but they did accomplish the goal of providing a table where people could and would sit down together. So the question in writing this, I was thinking, where did I look for inspiration? Because there was no Greens cookbook. There was no vegetarian cooking for everyone. There were virtually no vegetarian cookbooks then. The health food books that appeared in the Kirshner Library and the O'Keeffe Collection were pretty much already out of print, and they weren't really considered collectibles, I don't think. There was the Farm Cookbook written by Stephen Gaskin's class that had a very heavy emphasis on nutritional yeast and tofu. There was the 10 Talents Cookbook recipes by the Seventh-day Adventists that had an emphasis on nut cutlets and things like that. Then later there would be Diet for a Small Planet and Laurel Kitchen, and although those foods were better, they were still that kind of healthful, earnest, vegetarian variety. They weren't very sexy. They weren't very appealing. There were not really Italian cookbooks available then, which are such a great source of plant-based recipes. There was a paperback called Leaves of Our Tuscan Ancestors, which was billed as vegetarian, but which wasn't really. Italian was considered one cuisine, not many as it is now. The same was true for Mexican, Chinese, Greek, Indian, and so forth. And with few exceptions, books from these food cultures hadn't actually been written yet. So they weren't around to draw on. Excuse me. There was nothing to turn to that would move vegetarian meals forward, to becoming food that a stranger would feel comfortable and even delighted to sit down to. So for inspiration, I turned to Gourmet Magazine. I used my very small stipend to get a subscription to that. The Time Life International Cookbook, the French classics that are in the Kirshner Collection, Pelleprat, Escoffier, Larousse, and the more recent Julia Child's Art of French Cooking. My approach was to study these books very carefully and see if there were elements that I could pull out of a dish and set on its own. For example, French dishes that had the words à la forestière in them usually included mushrooms, even if they were a beef dish. So after looking at these recipes and many attempts, I figured out how to make something I called the mushroom ragout that I could serve with polenta rather than as a side to the beef that it was paired with. Now, this is something we really take for granted today. And even yesterday at the campus club, I was served an absolutely delicious ragout, not a mushroom one, other vegetables. But in 1970, nobody did this. And not only that, people called them ragouts instead of ragouts. So, I had to go back to doing stews. Anyway, I got a lot of good ideas from Craig Claiborne's International Collection, partly because some of the countries he included, in fact, most of them, had very vegetable-intensive cuisines. And the number of recipes were already worked out, such as spanakopita, curries, crepes, ratatouille. And they could, with some tweaking, become vegetarian main dishes. What's more, they could be paired with other foods that were in the same chapter so that there was some continuity when you made a menu, for a meal, which was important to me. Finally, a vegetarian cookbook appeared that did just what I was attempting to do and then took it further. And that was Anna Thomas's book, The Vegetarian Epicure. And when that book came out, it felt like Anna Thomas just dropped from the sky with a basket full of goodies. She didn't come to us by the way of any counterculture group. She just appeared via her books, which were vegetarian, but they weren't strange vegetarian. She was smart, she had traveled, she obviously liked to cook, she clearly loved to eat, and she happened to be vegetarian. She was a fun read. You could get on the boat right with her or join her in a favorite European cafe and taste what she had tasted. Her recipes were the ones we made for special occasions. They took a lot of time to make, and they used richer and more expensive ingredients than we were used to, but they were always hits. They never failed. As I poured through my little tiny cookbook collection in the early 1970s, I was looking for recipes, but more than that, I was hunting for pairings and combinations of foods and flavors, for sequences of steps, for basic techniques like deglazing and reducing. I didn't have a lot of experience eating out. We didn't do that quite so much then. And I didn't have a very well-formed palate. But later, as I began to eat out, I ate everything, including meat, because I wanted to see what normal food was like and what it felt like. It showed me saltiness, texture, balance, and harmony, qualities that I strive to build into my own cooking. And since vegetables often tend to be sweet and lacking in anything that approaches the texture of muscle, it was a huge challenge to create vegetarian dishes that could get outside that sweet and soft range. And honestly, it still is a challenge for me. But gradually, the food changed, and July 4th, 1979, we opened Greens. I had been asked to be the chef, and it was a doozy of a job. I'm still trying to get over it. The restaurant was not a little 10-seat restaurant, which I was hoping. It seated 90 at a time. The huge west wall of the restaurant was all glass, and it faces the Golden Gate Bridge and the Marina Green. There was lots of free parking, which I'm sure helped draw our customers. But by then, I had cooked at Chez Panisse, I had traveled to Europe, and I had a somewhat clearer vision of what was possible. And I think the food was pretty good, and it was pretty to look at, and it was light, and it was full of color and interesting shapes and varieties of vegetables. I really do feel that Greens turned people's experience of vegetarian food upside down. No one knew it could be delicious and familiar, but with a twist, and exciting, and also sufficient. But what really made the food good for me was not so much our cooking, which when I look back on it now seems a little dicey, but it was the produce we had to work with. The Zen Center had a farm called Green Gulch Farm in Marin County, and that was just 25 minutes from the restaurant. When I had been in Paris before it opened, I went to Ville-Marin. I ransacked their seed cabinets. I bought lots of seeds back. So we were actually able to serve many beautiful, beautiful lettuces, including the Marvel of Four Seasons, which was sort of the gateway heirloom lettuce, I think. Fingerling potatoes, arugula, greens of all kinds, big brassicas, cauliflower, broccoli, and many, many kinds of fragrant herbs, golden beets, golden chard, red chard, all things that were so colorful and so lovely. I drove into the restaurant every morning as soon as my car was loaded up with this. And during the trip, I sat enveloped in this incredible fragrance. Vegetables are actually very sweet smelling when they're freshly picked and put together. And during the trip, I thought about how I'd use this produce once I got to work. Now, this may not seem particularly unusual today. This is the farm-to-table era, and this kind of cooking professes to be everywhere. And plenty of you have had the experience of walking into Trader Joe's or another store and picking up bags of fingerlings or German butterballs or arugula, mixed salad greens, olive oil, many choices of olive oil, packages of herbs, Cinderella pumpkins, you know, all of that, and so forth. But at that time, none of that existed. It really didn't, unless you grew it yourself. And we did. So this was kind of a revolutionary moment, and it was a really exciting, exciting moment to be cooking, because we didn't really know what we were cooking with. You know, most of us hadn't seen it before either. Some of us thought this movement would not go very far. We thought maybe this is just going to remain a Berkeley and San Francisco phenomena, but of course it didn't. The food movement took off, and now we have good food pretty much everywhere. I do want to mention that the Seed Savers Exchange was about 4 years old then, so it was just at that point putting together its exchange of heirloom seeds that eventually came out into the world and gave us the diversity that we now enjoy today. We couldn't have guessed that when I was growing up. In fact, looking through the Kirshner Collection, especially in the older books, and in my own books too, very seldom is a recipe that uses a vegetable designating the variety of vegetable. Beets are beets. You don't know if they're red, if they're cylindrical, if they're round, if they're kyoya. They're just beets because there was only probably about one kind that we commonly saw. It's only today, I think, that that definition has become more expected and de rigueur. When I lived at Green Gulch Farm during the 70s, my house was an old bull shed. My first room was a horse stall, but then I graduated to the bull shed. And the shed had been converted to be a little bit more hospitable for human dwelling. And the yard was a sea of compacted earth that had been walked on for years by animals that weighed well over a ton. I had never thought to plant anything before, even though my father was a botanist and a really good gardener. My brother's a farmer and also a botanist. It never occurred to me until I looked at this sea of dirt, knowing it was going to be really slick the minute it rained, and it did rain. And I thought, I have to plant something. And so I got a little sage plant like that big, and a shovel would not break the earth. I had to go back and get a pickaxe and pick a little tiny hole and put that sage plant in. But with that gesture, I was suddenly hooked. I couldn't stop thinking about growing plants. That's all it took. And I quickly heard about a nursery in Sonoma County and went there the next weekend. And I didn't know, but it was their birthday, so they were offering champagne as we walked into the door. So my first trip to a nursery was greeted with champagne, and kind of like the dog who remembers that the FedEx person always has a biscuit and never forgets, even though that person has gone on to some other job, I still kind of half expect a glass of champagne when I go to a nursery. So to me, it was a very celebratory kind of thing. I was excited. And I used my little stipend to buy plants, but I could only afford the smallest ones. And my husband, I think, was either bemused or horrified that I was so obsessed on spending these few dollars on tiny plants that had a slim chance of surviving the quail that like to take a dust bath in their roots, or the deer or the rabbits who are just as interested in their tops. But I had a theory. And it was really an instinct at that time that even though this didn't make any sense, especially with me as a Zen student and also running greens and having no time and energy really except maybe a half an hour on a Sunday afternoon to dig a little patch that I might be able to plant something in, I felt I should pursue this because you never know when a passion might come back and take hold. And in fact, I didn't stay at Zen Center for too many more years. I did live in Rome and studied gardens there for a year. I did continue to plant plants and make a beautiful garden. And one day, where I live in Galisteo, I looked around me and I thought to myself, maybe I could grow some vegetables. And I did. And the effort of my garden over the years actually became the book Vegetable Literacy. But sustaining and feeding this new interest of mine, it was not done only through plants, it was also done through books. I'm kind of an old-fashioned book person, library person. I thank you for your talk about the other things the library does, because I still think library should be quiet, you know, and I can't get used to the fact people just talk in normal voices and so forth. But anyway, I am a kind of a book person, and I happen to feel the same way about acquiring books. That is, if you're drawn to a book, and even if you don't know why, or it doesn't seem to make sense, you should just go ahead and acquire it and even read it. But if you don't, that's okay, because you might read it sometime, and that has certainly happened to me. And I did acquire books on botany, on plants, on gardens, and so much so that at a certain point, I needed to add a huge, large bookshelf along one whole wall of my office. And I found myself giving away cookbooks to make room for even more plant and garden books. And one day, when I wasn't sure what my next step was, and this is fairly recently, I have to admit, I looked at my library and I realized that my interests had shifted. The landscape of my bookshelf, in fact, had changed. There were fewer cookbooks, there were more memoirs, there were more history books, and a lot of books on plants and gardens that I hadn't quite realized I had amassed because it was such a gradual process. It's a little like my teacher, Suzuki Roshi, used to say, when you walk in the fog, you get wet, but very slowly, very gradually. It's different from walking in the rain. And that's kind of what happened to my bookshelf. It gradually changed. Now, you might be thinking, shouldn't you know about yourself, like what your interests are? Isn't that pretty basic? And, well, sometimes you don't know. And it's different for all of us and at different times. Some of us are always just feeling our way into the next thing in our lives. And if we discover certain new passions and interests in bookstores, and we buy those books and we take them home and read them and shelve them, then our library becomes a kind of a talking wall, something that tells us about ourselves and about who we are and what we're drawn to. And that's what happened to me. And Georgia O'Keeffe's library told me something about her. And Mrs. Kirshner's collection also says something about who she was. Books keep us alive. They feed us and others, which is another value of libraries and collections. I have a young niece who's very bright, very well educated. She does not want to own a single book. If she can download it, she much prefers to do that. I also will listen to books on CD when I'm driving, and I enjoy that a lot. The last one I listened to was 1493, a book about the Columbian Exchange. It's not the easiest book to listen to in traffic in strange cities in California. So when I got home, I bought a copy so that I could sit down and read it with a little bit more concentration. I couldn't have guessed from listening to it that it's fabulously illustrated. The illustrations are interesting, they're compelling, but you miss that completely if all you're doing is hearing. So sitting down and going through a book, looking at the typeface, looking at illustrations is as much as about reading the information. I can think of many books that are handsomely illustrated, and sometimes they become the reason for owning a book. The Naming of Names by Anna Pavord was such a book with me. It has gorgeous plates on plants. The Chamberlain book that I mentioned earlier is another example. The black and white photographs and the pen and ink drawings show us an atmosphere that spoke to the author at that time. And the illustrations also show us a world that used to be and one that has changed. They alert us to our own history, where we come from, who we are, and what we've lost, and sometimes what we've gained. Recently, I found on my own library shelf a book about growing fruit in dry places. It wasn't written for today's new aridity. It was written in 1913. And I bought it because I loved the embossed cover. I love the way covers were made at that time. And it's been living in my office for about 20 years. Suddenly, it's relevant. Yes, UC Davis, where I grew up, you know, I'm sure there's tons of people doing research on growing fruit in dry climates, but, you know, this probably has some valuable information that we can use right now. Another book from the same year called Food and Flavor, again, bought for the cover, turns out to read a lot like Carlo Petrini, the founder of of slow food. And there's even a dedication to Luther Burbank, the California plant breeder, who gave us the Santa Rosa plum, the Shasta daisy, pluots, the Burbank russet potato, and wonderful, wonderful foods and flowers and fruits. Of course, Petrina's presentation is very today, it's very fresh and contemporary, and this has the English of a whole century ago, but the thoughts and concerns are pretty much the same. Which brings me back to the beginning. Books I see, and especially this collection, is the Kirshner Collection, are a record of our history, and that in libraries, these collections can tell us about our history, or its owner, or even about our current selves. The Kirshner Collection is about food and cooking, and because we all eat, it's especially relevant to all of us. But there is also information that students of other disciplines could unearth and use if they want to. Food is, after all, about life. Because it's such a vast collection, it has a great deal to say about the world we live in and where we came from. And after spending time in such a collection, it might just help us move forward into our futures while deepening our understanding of our past and also our present. So thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, if I can hear them. I know, it's time for coffee and chatting.
I have a big cookbook collection, but I find myself lazy. And if I want to cook something, I turn on my computer and search. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes, I do. We all do that. So, I mean, my cookbooks are right there, just a few feet from my computer, and I do it too, but I never use what I find. The reason why is because so often, first of all, you don't know who the author is when you're looking at recipes online. A lot of times I find my recipes, but introductions are taken away, steps are shortened. They're not really how I write a recipe for somebody, you know, to cook with. And I'm sure that happens to other people as well, not just me. So if I'm cooking something I'm really unfamiliar with, I might go online to get a gist of it. But then I'll take a little more time to look in a cookbook or go to somebody specific online. But I think it's a shortcut that we all want to take, but you don't know the person, you don't know the voice, you don't know their experience, and then the people who judge the recipes, you don't know anything about them, you know. So as long as you keep all that in mind and it works for you, go ahead and do it. But you should keep that in mind, that it's not the most surefire way. I mean, I think one of the reasons people like cookbooks and write them and also read them is because they begin to like the voice of the person who's telling the story, or they've eaten at their restaurant, or they know something about them. There's some kind of a connection. Even if they've never met the person, it doesn't matter. What you have online is hard to connect to, unless you happen to know the person, I think. Yes? There's a microphone coming.
You made me laugh because I became a vegetarian in 1969, and my first cookbook was Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit.
Oh yeah, my mom had that.
And it was horrifying because
yes, it is
I was not only a vegetarian, but my mom made me eat Pep-Up. Remember Pep-Up? It was this mix of calcium, soy lecithin, calcium lactate, and nutritional yeast, because it was the only way you could get vitamin B12.
I don't know. I remember going to a friend's house. Actually, this girl who was my age has moved to Minneapolis and has lived here a long time. And her mom used to feed us tiger's milk. What I really wanted was a Coke. You know, I wanted a soft drink, and I wanted to go to somebody's house who watched American Bandstand, because we didn't have a TV or Coke or any of that, you know, but we had lots of Tiger's milk.
So the other funny thing was, it was really relief when Diet for a Small Planet came along. From Adele
Yes,
Davis.
that's true. It's all about perspective.
So we have daughters getting married this summer. What cookbook should we buy them?
Oh, heavens. Well, what are they interested in?
I haven't been very interested in cooking until now.
Well, you know, I actually think that the Joy of Cooking that came out the same year that Vegetarian Cooking for Everyone came out is pretty good. I mean, you know, if they are eating meat, if they're, you know, omnivores, then get something that they can use, you know, very widely. And I think that that's a good book. If you're asking about my book, I can talk with you later, because I've written all kinds of books. But, you know, something really basic. I grew up on The Joy of Cooking. Other people grew up on Fannie Farmer. James Beard is great. I mean, he's classic American cooking. Those recipes work. They're very dated, but they still work. I'm not sure there's anything wrong with being somewhat dated if it's good quality.
I would just like to say that I would like to promote this book, since the author is being too modest about it, because I've owned, I think this is the 4th volume I've owned of it. Of course, it's the new version, but I'm on my 3rd copy of Vegetarian Cooking for Everyone, because I kept loaning it out to friends and never getting it back. But I will say that having used this, and I've got also an extensive cookbook collection, that this is just a great all-round cookbook. And anyone who doesn't know how to cook, I send them to this cookbook. Because you can cook, you can add meat to a lot of things, but if you want a great cornbread recipe, it's in here. And a great pie crust recipe is in here. You can make a tart, you can make a salad, you can make cooked vegetables. Everything is in there. So I am not getting a kickback on this so far.
How do you know?
But it's a perfect all-round cookbook. So the commercial segment is now finished.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Could you speculate on why you think the convergence of people like you and Alice Waters and all that happened in Berkeley? Why do you think that all happened around the same time, with the interest in food, this whole enterprise that you've been involved in that has eventually spread to other places? But it started there. And what do you think the components were?
For many years, I was the assistant to a writer who lived on the East Coast on Long Island in Old Westbury, and she knew people like Jock Whitney, and they used to say things like, well, you know, if you tip the United States, all the loose nuts go to the West. So I think that there's something that's true about that. I mean, the West does seem to attract a kind of feeling of adventure, you know. Lots of things happened in the West, you know, in Berkeley especially, the free speech movement, you know, in the 60s, Mario Savio, you know, a lot happened. Why did it happen there? Well, I think probably it was a time, you know, all of us who worked at Chez Panisse, nobody had gone to cooking school. You know, you had an anthropologist, you had an architect, you had a this, you had a that. You know, people had gotten training in something else, but then somehow I think there was a kind of dissatisfaction in the careers that people chose, or they didn't want to be in academia. I don't know, I mean, because I was just there doing it. But now you have a lot of young people who are interested in farming, you know, and social justice around food, and we didn't have that so much then. So it's kind of shifted one more time, and some people speculate that futures look kind of grim for young people. Not everyone's going to graduate college and go on and get a great job that they love. I don't know. I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I should just say if I don't know, I'll try not to answer it. But if any of you have ideas about it, I'd like to have that conversation. Yes, James. Okay.
But I thank you for...
I have an idea.
Okay, Jim.
And I'd like you to react to it. But it's so interesting you were at the Zen Center, none of which I knew, but the Zen Center was the first in the United States, San Francisco Zen Center, and that cant toward Asia, which has a different kind of cooking versus the cant toward Europe on the East Coast. And I think that might have been a factor. What do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I'll tell you about the Zen Center. If you take away movies and sex and lots of other good things like that, and you're left with cooking, you know? You're left with food. So everybody wanted to cook, you know. Even though they couldn't do it, they wanted to eat.
That's a wonderful word.
Thank you.
Don't go away. Deborah, stay here one sec. What a wonderful presentation and a celebration, too, of cookbooks that we have and that have been part of your experience. A little something for you to remember us by.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, thank you.
One more thing for your carry-on bag.
Thank you so much.
And I have one request for you to help me.
Okay.
We have the names of all of you in this basket, and she is going to, without looking, pick one for a copy of her cookbook. Just one.
Okay.
And we have here Mike Price. Let's see. Oh.
Wendy, I just want to say that Mr. Price and his wife came here from Madison, Wisconsin.
Oh, my goodness.
Been vegetarians for many years and brought their
Fabulous
son and daughter.
to travel all the way from the Badger State and the cheese capital to join us this evening. That's wonderful. One more thing, if I could ask Karen Koepp, our new president, to come and say a very short words to close us out for this evening. And while she's making her way up here, I will share with you that there are copies of Deborah's books for purchase, and also she's willing to autograph if you're interested in that as well. Karen?
I know you have all had your bodies, minds, and hearts fed wonderfully tonight. Thank you so much to Deborah. Thank you, Wendy, for everything you do for the library day in and day out. My first official act as president of the Friends, I just want to invite you to come and enjoy each other's company and the wonderful ideas and activities of the Friends all season long next year. Starting with Craig Packer in the fall, ending with Kevin Kling in the spring. We have a great series of events. Please come. Thank you again.